Okay, I think we can start. 4:31. I hope that those joining us online can hear me. If you can't, please let me know in the chat ASAP. Otherwise, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dean Zimmerman from Rutgers University. Distinguished Professor of Philosophy. Gained his Doctor of Philosophy degree from Brown University, where he worked with Jae-Gwon Kim and Roderick Chisholm. He taught at the University of Notre Dame and Syracuse University prior to joining Rutgers, where he is now also director of the Rutgers Center for the Philosophy of Religion. He serves on the board of advisors for the Mark Sanders Foundation and is a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers. He is an influential figure in contemporary metaphysics and has worked on issues in the philosophy of time, on personhood and material constitution, the metaphysics and the metaphysics of mind. In the philosophy of religion, Professor Zimmerman has worked on divine foreknowledge and human free will and God and time. And most importantly of all, he is a keyboardist for the band Jigs and the Pigs. That's correct. Yes, that's right. His articles published, as far as I can tell, are 48 in number. And he's edited a number of very influential books, collections of papers in metaphysics, including Metaphysics Big Questions with Peter van Inwagen, the Oxford Handbook of Metaphysics with Michael Lux, and Persons Human and Divine, and Contemporary Debates in Metaphysics with Ted Sider and John Hawthorne. He's also the editor of the Oxford Studies in Metaphysics, which is an incredibly important annual collection of metaphysics papers published by Oxford University Press.
With excellent papers in it on time.
Well, I mean. And I have to say, just on a personal note, that, you know, your papers in the philosophy of time were very influential to me as a graduate, on me as a graduate student, and I think they're been hugely influential in metaphysics of time. Just so your work has been so important in metaphysics of time, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here today. So thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, for that fulsome introduction. It's great to be back here. I haven't been here since there were joint meetings here. I don't know when that was. Quite a while ago, joint meetings held here. And I had a lovely time then, and I'm sure this will be great too. Thank you. Okay, so this is a talk I try to give at sort of different levels for different audiences, attempting to to say that there's still something to be said for the cosmological argument. I mean, as a matter of fact, people are still addressing this question. People are still trying to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? This old chestnut. And, you know, it's ancient. You've got Hume, you've got Samuel Clarke, you've got Anselm, and of course, it's the standard thing is to try to turn it into an argument for the existence of God. The basic form of the question is something like there has to be an answer to this question. All the attempts to answer it that don't involve God or something very much like God are no good. So the answer to the question implies that God exists. Boom. So that's the typical form. The reason I think the cosmological argument isn't in that sort of form, is not taken to be totally compelling anymore, is that this first premise, why is there something rather than nothing, must have an answer, is not taken to be obvious anymore. So the principle of sufficient reason was the name for the claim that it must have an answer, or the principle of sufficient reason implies that you've got to have an answer for why anything exists at all. But there may well be brute facts that have no explanation, and once you allow some brute facts in the back door, for instance, in indeterministic kind of physics, it's hard to think, well, this principle has to be true across the board. So why is there something rather than nothing? The answer might be, well, there is no answer. There's just a brute fact. I think we can save something, though, of the cosmological argument, and contemporary philosophers do this by thinking about answering this question as a matter of theoretical preferability. So if you have a question and it seems like it could have an answer, then a theory, a set of beliefs, a coherent sort of picture of things, is better than it would otherwise be if it can tell a story that answers the question. So a worldview, if you like, is better, at least prima facie better, to the extent that it explains facts that seem susceptible of explanation. Now, this is definitely other things being equal kind of principle. Some stories would explain a fact if they were true, but they're intrinsically implausible or they're known to be false. Still, answering questions is a plus in a theory. And if positing something can explain things that otherwise can't be explained, then belief in that thing should get an epistemic boost, to get a little thumbs up. Now, to argue for the existence of something on the grounds that it is theoretically preferable because it allows you to explain some things. Arguing in this way would require, for the existence of God, would require surveying all other possible ways of answering the question. And of course, I'm not going to be able to even begin to do that. What I want to try to do is give a framework for thinking about the question and look at some ways of answering it. And I do want to argue that theism does enable one to give an answer that has some plausibility. And we'll find that we'll find some people attempting to answer it without God and not doing a very good job. So right. So I think I've been through all of this. Basically, we end up with an other things being equal sort of argument for theism. So how do we approach the question? Well, first let's ask what are good answers to the question, why does this or that thing exist? Not why does anything exist at all, this or that thing. I'm going to think of these as stories, and you can think of them as theories or sets of propositions or something. Stories that explain why the thing had to exist, or at least why it was very likely to exist. If it had a beginning, how did it come into existence? Or why has it always been around? It's always existed. A really good candidate explanation would remove any element of mystery about the thing. Would make it unsurprising that it should exist if they were true. I wonder if these are the same, if I've sent you the very same slides that I had. But I'm having second thoughts about some of my remarks. There are little notes at the bottom. I'm not sure. Do I really think that? So I may have sent on earlier thoughts. So if I change my mind, oh, God doesn't exist. A big surprise at the end. Okay. But we're not asking why does this exist or why does that thing exist. We're asking why does anything at all exist? And if you had a story that explained why something or other had to exist, or why it was at least very likely to exist, then you'd have an answer to this question. Now, it's plausible to think that some things had to exist that are very boring. For instance, if mathematics is a theory about numbers, and numbers have to exist for mathematics to be true, and mathematics would have been true even if there hadn't been any tables or chairs or particles or fields or space, then there are some things that had to exist, but they're very boring. They don't do anything. They don't have causes, and they're not affected by anything. So I'm going to set aside boring things and think just about interesting things. And by interesting things, I mean things that could cause other things to happen. I should probably say things that could be caused as well, because they're sort of interesting. So things that can affect other things. Could we explain why there are any such things at all? So we'll ignore things like numbers and the empty set, stuff like that. So I'm changing our question to the question, why does something interesting exist rather than nothing? So what kind of stories could we use? To think about the stories in a kind of a systematic way, we can divide them into the stories that are necessary and the stories that are contingent. Okay. To conclude that God is the best part, or that God is always part of any of the best stories, you'd have to look at all the possible hosts, and that's going to be impossible. So I'm just going to divide them up into these two kinds and think a little bit about the two different kinds. And to explain the difference, I'll need to say something about contingency and necessity. This will, because I realize now that I'm looking mostly at philosophers and students of philosophy, I think this could be, we can go over this very rapidly. So necessity and possibility. Why is my slide not advancing? There we go. We've got contingent stories that they're things that are true. You know, if a contingent story is true, it didn't have to be true. Necessary stories are stories that had to be true, and some of them are about necessary things. So we need to know about necessary things too. Possible worlds, as everybody here will know, are kind of useful. But I'm thinking of them as just complete ways that things could have been, not places that we could go. They're like books, but not books that anybody has to write down. They're a sort of complete way that everything could be. The actual world is the story of us, is the way that things actually are. So necessary claims are true under any conditions whatsoever, and they're true no matter what world had been the case. Possible ones have to be true in some world or other, and the contingently true things are true in the actual world. So a contingent answer, a contingent story that answers the question, why is there anything interesting rather than nothing? We're going to encounter a couple of those. And we're also going to look at some necessary stories. And the necessary stories, sometimes they talk about a necessary thing. So a necessary thing is something that where it's necessarily true that it exists. It exists in all possible ways. And a contingent thing, it's true that it exists, but just in the actual world, but maybe not others. Now, the null world is interesting because that's the one, if there is such a thing, then it's the world with no interesting things. And we could put our question, why not the null world? Why wasn't the null world the case? Okay, here's the strategy. I'm going to look at some relatively recent attempts to tell a contingent scientific story that answers the question by saying that a natural law could explain why a universe popped into existence at a finite distance in the past. I'm going to criticize those and then turn to other contingent stories that say there's always been some contingent things and the earlier ones cause the later ones, and that gives us an explanation. So those would be the contingent stories I look at, and I think they're pretty representative of the kind. Necessary stories come in two sorts. There's the ones that are about contingent things that say it's a necessary truth that there had to be something or other. But for any particular thing you pick out, it didn't have to exist. Okay. So that's one sort of story. Those are interesting. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to just talk about the more typical necessary stories about a necessary thing. Okay. So there are these attempts, relatively recent, to give a kind of scientific explanation of how a universe with a finite past could come into existence and why it would come into existence. Reasonably recent. And in fact, just yesterday, I was kind of looking over my notes and Googled some stuff, and it's like, oh, the Scientific American has another article about why a universe like ours was probable. So it's an ongoing thing, and we of course have to look at the latest attempts. But a little while ago, Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking, they're both cosmologists, astrophysicists, or theoretical physicists and cosmologists, offered a kind of scientific explanation of how a universe with a finite past could come about and be explained by scientific means. Now, Krauss's general strategy is, I think it's a sort of a trick. He redefines nothing so that a physical something or other qualifies as nothing, and then that thing caused everything else. Hawking has a different strategy, and Krauss sort of advocates that as well, as we'll see. But here's Krauss's strategy. Inflation, you'll all know, you'll have bumped into it, I'm sure. A process that is supposed to have happened shortly after the Big Bang, causing the universe to grow rapidly in size. And this is supposed to explain some features of the large-scale features of the universe. And he makes use of that in his theory. I should say something about fields. We've all kind of gotten used to the idea that there are fields in addition to particles located in space. There's electromagnetic fields and so on. Krauss points out that the way quantum theory understands fields, there can be a field that fills a region of space that counts as empty space or a vacuum because it has no particles in it, but the field is still there. And there's nevertheless enough energy in the field to give rise to a universe that is not empty, not in a vacuum state, but full of matter. And he claims there's empirical evidence for thinking that our universe resulted from a field that's empty in this special sense. And so this field that gave rise to our universe counts as nothing because there's no particles in it. And here's a quote: observable features of the universe are strongly suggestive that our universe arose through a process like that of inflation, a process whereby the energy of empty space, nothing, he says, gets converted into the energy of something. Now that sort of sounds like a trick, and David Albert, who's one of my colleagues, he's at Columbia, he teaches Rutgers every year as well. He says this is a trick. he's got a PhD in physics too. He's not just a philosopher. He wrote a scathing review of Krauss's book, and this led to a big flare up. And if you want to see, uh, uh, physicists getting angry at one another, so you can just Google it. So he says, what kind of nothing is this field? He says a relativistic quantum field theoretical vacuum state. Well, that, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, that too is a particular arrangement of elementary physical stuff. Now, to be fair to Krauss, he is perfectly aware of this. And if you read further in the book, as Albert did, but if you read further in the book, he says, after explaining how nothing could cause everything to exist, he says, okay, well, look, back in the day, you'd be happy to describe a purely empty space possessing no real material particles as nothing. So why aren't you happy with this now? Why aren't you allowing that I've explained how something could come from nothing? But in other moods, he's more straight, more forthcoming and says, okay, my nothing is a very interesting contingent thing. So it would be disingenuous to suggest that empty space endowed with energy, which drives inflation, is really nothing. It's in fact a complicated boiling brew of virtual particles that pop in and out of existence. So the nothing he appeals to is a particular arrangement of physical stuff, as Albert puts it. And it might explain why the rest of the universe is here, but it doesn't explain where that brewing, bubbling field came from. And it doesn't seem like a thing that had to exist. I mean, if this theory about the quantum state from which our universe came is a true theory, it's a contingent theory. And it might not be true, it's a piece of speculative physics. But the question is, if it were true, would it explain why there's anything interesting at all? Well, the problem is it's an interesting thing, and we want to know, where did it come from? So at this point, Krauss shifts gear and talks about an idea from Stephen Hawking, an idea that Stephen Hawking himself thinks can explain why there's something rather than nothing. And so Krauss says, okay, maybe that isn't the nothing, but I've got this other story I can tell, the story that Stephen Hawking told. So on this picture, you look at the kind of universe described by Hartle and Hawking when they gave a description of the universe in a way that combines quantum theory and gravity in a finite universe, finite past. And they said if the universe takes a certain form, according to Hawking anyway, that would mean there's a law of nature that makes it probable that universes exist. And so he thought, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? Why this particular set of laws and not some other? These are quotes from Hawking. Some would claim the answer to these questions is that there's a God who chose to create the universe that way. We claim, however, that it is possible to answer these questions purely within the realm of science and without invoking divine beings. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Okay, well, what does he mean by that? In the background is the Hartle-Hawking model of a finite universe. So here is the really interesting thing about this Hartle-Hawking model. You might think that something coming out of nothing would violate the conservation of energy. But there's a theory of quantum gravity that allows for universes that have a beginning and have a net energy of zero. The universe as a whole has a net energy of zero. So you might have thought, well, if the universe pops into existence, this would violate conservation of energy. And what they show is that that's not so, which is very interesting. So if the laws of the theory of quantum gravity that they propose were true, then the appearances of universes with beginnings wouldn't violate the conservation of energy. Now, Hawking and Krauss want to claim something further about what is shown by the possibility of universes obeying these kinds of laws. Something more than just the fact that conservation of energy is consistent with it. They want to say, if the laws of that theory of quantum gravity were true, the appearances of certain kinds of universes would be possible, even probable. In effect, the proposal is that there's a contingent law of nature that says it's very probable that a universe will appear without anything causing it to come into existence. This is to explain why there's something rather than nothing in terms of a law of nature. So, an interesting idea. David Albert is not impressed by this either. So when Krauss appeals to Hawking's idea, David Albert has this to say: what kind of a law is that? It's not just the laws of quantum gravity that are assumed by the Hartle-Hawking model of the universe. Those laws are like other physical laws. They take the existence of elementary particles and elementary physical stuff, fields, for granted, and they tell us how such stuff can be arranged. They tell us what kind of universes are possible. Laws are rules about possible and impossible arrangements of stuff, rules typically connecting earlier arrangements to later ones. The law that Hawking and Krauss posit is nothing like that. It has nothing to operate on. So if there is a law of nature that says it's probable that universes will pop into existence, that's not a law that says, here's how physical stuff can be arranged. So that's David Albert's objection, and it seems to be a good one. I think, and this is something that I think Albert wouldn't go with me all the way on this. Tim Maudlin would, another philosopher of physics. What's going on? Oh, okay. I thought you were trying to show me that something terrible was happening. Okay. I take it that laws should be explaining how some things come to be because of the powers or activities of some other existing thing. How previous states of the universe generate later states of the universe. So if you use a law to explain the existence of something, it presupposes some other thing that is what generated that later thing. But then you need an explanation for the existence of that thing, and so on. So either we're left with an uncaused thing, or you've got a series of causes that goes back with no beginning. So on a contingent story that's trying to explain why there are interesting things at all, an uncaused cause would have to be contingent. It's a contingent story. Given how laws explain, it couldn't be explained by a law or a principle. An uncaused contingent thing at the back of all the other contingent things would leave us with no answer to the question, why is there anything at all? So the only remaining contingent story would have to appeal to an infinite series of contingent things, each causally explained by others. So that takes us to kind of more familiar contingent story of why there's anything at all, kind of story where you have an infinite past and things have always been causing later things. Hume thought famously that if that's what the past was like, then we're good. We're home. We've got an explanation of everything. And he articulated a principle to the effect that if every member of a series of things has a causal explanation, then the existence of the whole series is explained. Suppose the universe has always consisted of contingent things, which were caused to exist by earlier ones, and so on. Since each one is explained, then it looks like you could have an explanation of everything in the history of the universe. Samuel Clarke, who lived earlier than Hume, had already objected to this sort of principle. He gave an argument for the existence of God, and it included as a premise the denial of Hume's principle. Suppose one contingent thing causes another, which causes another, and so on. If the series of causes stays within the collection contingent things, there remains the question, why does the whole series exist? It's as though, it's as though you met a race of beings who claim to have always been around, bug-eyed green aliens. And they say, well, what do you mean, where do we come from? We've always existed, our parents had parents and so on. Well, you would still want to ask, well, why are there green bug-eyed aliens rather than not? So if Clarke's right about that, then these contingency stories that posit an infinite past don't really succeed in explaining why there are any interesting things at all. This is a point that William Rowe used to make in his discussions of the cosmological argument. He endorsed right here. So to sum up then, contingency stories that just talk about laws and say, well, there's a law that predicts interesting stuff. So our cosmos exists to obey that law. Well, that kind of story can't explain where the stuff comes from, why it exists at all. And you're going to end up with either an uncaused cause or an infinite series, and neither sort of story will do the job. Okay, so let's turn then to necessary stories. And I'm going to skip the necessary stories that don't say there's a necessary being that caused other things. So we've got these two kinds. I'm going to skip that one, but it's an interesting angle, and maybe some people want to press that. Now, stories that have necessary being that's interesting, that explains why all the other interesting stuff exists. There's two basic strategies that you could follow. You could suppose that this necessary being is made out of the stuff in our universe. So it's this kind of, made out of whatever our universe is made out of. Or you could suppose that it's made out of some of the stuff of our universe. You could suppose that it's maybe God is space-time itself, and the particles are embedded in God, like raisins embedded in a cake or something, or the entire sum. The other strategy is to suppose the necessary being is distinct from, but able to cause the stuff in our universe. Now, how to evaluate these kinds of stories that posit a necessary being? William James famously said, some forms of being have been deemed more natural, so to say, or more inevitable and necessary than others. And I think he thought that this was a reasonable thing to think. I want to propose a kind of non-arbitrariness test for a posited necessary being that could explain other stuff. So if something X belongs to a family of very similar, seemingly possible objects, X can be necessarily existing, and the rest of the family not, only if X is strikingly different from the others in some way. Otherwise, all should be necessary or none. Okay. Now, I don't know where I, how to justify this principle. Seems plausible to me. I hope I didn't just pull it out of thin air, but I'm going to appeal to it. And in practice, philosophers have generally made use of this idea. Okay, so with that in our pocket, let's look at some examples of these two strategies. The first strategy was to say, well, there's a necessary being, it's interesting, it causes stuff, and it's made out of some of the stuff in our universe. Now you could pick, let's say, the first million years of our universe and say, everything that existed back then is a necessary being, and it caused all the other stuff. That seems rather arbitrary to start with the first, to stop at a million years. Or even to stop at just a few seconds and say that's a necessary being that caused everything else. It would be odd to say the necessary being is just a certain field that existed in the past and not the subsequent stages of that field. So the world as a whole, the sum total of all the interesting things, including our entire cosmos, that is a better candidate because it isn't arbitrarily sort of carved off. And of course, this is a familiar view in history philosophy, that the world as a whole is a necessary thing. And the problem with this sort of view is that if every little detail of the cosmos is necessary, then all appearance of contingency is mere appearance. It's not real. And it's very hard to believe that this is the only way that things could be. Why aren't slightly different universes possible? Now that might press you in the direction of saying, well, okay, maybe there was just some early stage of our universe that was necessary, and it could have given rise to very different things later on. I think this strategy is not looking good, because on the one hand, if it the interesting necessary thing can't just be a part of the stuff in our universe because that's not special enough. If it's the whole thing, and that's the only way things could be, then that makes everything necessary. If it's the whole thing, but it could have been slightly larger or could have been slightly smaller, well, that might be the best version of this view. But even then, why couldn't there have been other universes separate from ours? You can't get there from here. So I'm going to set this strategy aside as having some problems, and look instead at strategy number 2. Okay. So whatever we propose as the necessary, interesting thing, we should apply this test for necessary beings. Is it sufficiently strikingly different from other seemingly possible things that resemble it? If it's not, we shouldn't suppose that it is necessary, but those other things aren't. So any strikingly unique, seemingly possible being or combination of beings that could cause everything else is a good candidate, is a candidate to be considered. Greatest possible being. It's a famous one and a good choice. Of course, the worst possible being is also unique. If there is such a thing as the worst possible being, it would be very special, presumably very awful, but a very pessimistic sort of person might think that is the necessary being responsible for everything else. And the little glimmers of goodness that we see are, this being is allowing them just to snatch them away from us later on, perhaps, because it'll make it just look that much worse. Another alternative would be a kind of, dualistic picture that the greatest and the worst possible beings, they both exist necessarily, and we're stuck in the middle. I'm just going to look at the most popular one, the greatest possible being, the best possible being. if among all the possible beings, there is such a thing as a greatest possible being, well, then it is significantly different from all the other possible beings. And being best is a way of being special. It seems okay then to suppose that this being is necessary, but all the lesser beings are not. It sort of passes the William James-ish test. Okay, but so we've got this hypothesis that there's a necessary, interesting being caused everything else, but we still have a big question. Does positing such a being explain why there are any interesting things? So just saying that something is necessary doesn't explain why it's necessary. Can there be an explanation for the existence of a necessary being? And I think the answer to that is clearly yes. And to see what explanations for necessary beings would look like, we should look at the distinction between derivative and non-derivative things. So things come in more and less derivative sorts. This applies to contingent and necessary things. So the more derivative things depend upon the less derivative things. The more derivative things are nothing over and above the less derivative things. They exist because the less derivative things are in a certain arrangement or condition. So fists are more derivative than hands. Waves are more derivative than water. A fist is just a hand when it's clenched. A wave is just some water when it undulates. Undulates? Undulates. It's not a word I use in sentences. I added that sentence last night, but did not speak it out loud. So those are derivative and not less derivative things. The distinction applies to necessary things too. So if God is a necessary being, and if God necessarily thinks, well, then there are thoughts that exist necessarily, but they're God's thoughts. I mean, they're modifications of God, or they're things that exist only because God exists. If numbers are necessarily existing things, then sets of numbers are necessarily existing sets of things. But presumably the numbers are more fundamental than the sets. The sets are more derivative. And when you have a derivative thing, you can explain why it exists. So let's say X is derivatively necessary means that X exists in virtue of necessary facts about some other necessary thing. So when you say God exists necessarily, God thinks about everything that's possible, like unicorns. So the thought of a unicorn exists necessarily. Why? Well, because of that stuff I just said. There's a necessarily existing God who necessarily thinks of unicorns. This set of integers 1 to 10 exists in virtue of the fact that any things form a set, and 1 through 10 exist necessarily. So those are some derivatively necessary things that have an explanation as to why they're necessary. Now, could there be derivatively necessary beings that depend upon derivatively necessary beings, and so on, all the way down? Turtles all the way down, as it were. If not, and it doesn't seem, derivativeness, the reality has to sort of come up to the to the more derivative things from the less derivative things. And if you don't have some reality to begin with, you don't get any derivative reality. So it would seem that if there are derivatively necessary things, then there are some non-derivative necessary things. Now, derivatively necessary things can have an explanation for their existence. What about non-derivatively necessary beings? And if we're going to explain all the interesting things and we're going to appeal to God to do it, or a best possible being to do it, that thing had better be non-derivatively necessary. But could it have an explanation for its existence? things that are non-derivatively necessary are sometimes called self-existent. Its necessity doesn't come from something else, it comes from itself. But perhaps this can still count as having its existence explained as coming from its own nature. Okay. And here's where things get a little bit hairy, and I'm not entirely sure what I think. But let me try this out. So people, in fact, quite recently, people have been worrying about the sources of necessity. Where did necessity come from? Can we explain the necessary truths? And one strategy, Kit Fine, a lot of other people have used the strategy of explaining the source of necessity in the essences of things, which is a very traditional sort of view. So some kinds of necessity seem to be explainable in terms of the natures or essences of things. If it's in the nature of a thing so and so, then the thing had to be so and so. And if you understood the thing's nature, you'd see that it had to be so and so. And so that seems to provide a kind of explanation of necessity. Necessarily, Dean is human. Why? Well, being human is part of Dean's nature or essence. Necessarily, each triangle has three sides because it's in the nature of a triangle to have three sides. Now, is that those second claims, there being human is part of Dean's nature, or it's in the nature of a triangle to have three sides? Are those just contingently true? No, they're necessary truths. They have to be to explain why I have to be human or why triangles have to have three sides. But the fact that they're necessary doesn't necessarily have to be part of the explanation of the necessity. At least that is the sort of trick that Kit Fine and others have proposed. They want to explain necessity by appealing to facts about natures or essences. And you could say, well, those facts about natures or essences won't explain the necessity unless they're necessary. So you're just going around in a short circle. And they want to say, well, triangles have three sides, might be necessary, but I didn't appeal to that in my explanation. Okay, so maybe we can have an explanation of a necessity in terms of essences or natures that doesn't just immediately appeal to necessity. Now, you might not be able to grasp Dean's nature. You might not be able to know that I'm human. You might wonder whether I'm something else. You might not understand the definition of triangles, but just know that they had to have three sides. Still, there would be an explanation for these necessary truths in terms of the natures of the things. It's just you wouldn't understand it fully. And that, I take it, is what's being claimed when God is said to be self-existent and to exist necessarily because of God's nature. So a self-existent being, it's in its nature to exist. So just like my nature explains why I have to be human, the nature of a self-existent thing would explain why it exists. So a greatest possible being who is self-existent in this sense and who is interesting in virtue of causing everything else, that sort of being has been accepted by a lot of philosophers. St. Anselm, for example, more recently, Charles Hartshorne, that's Norman Malcolm, there's my colleague Al Plantinga when I was at Notre Dame. So this has been a traditional answer to the question of why is there something at all. Now, if there is such a thing, it surely doesn't look like this depiction of God by William Blake, but it's a cool picture anyway. So I thought I'd throw it in. We'll land on that one at the end, so you have something nice to look at. Let me sum up tell you sort of what I think. And now there's all these gaps in the story that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the necessary story that doesn't mention any necessary things. There's something to be said for that. We haven't talked about all the ways in which you might posit an impersonal but very special necessary being that's interesting that caused everything else. You might think there's some other contingent stories that could do a better job than Krauss and Hawking did, or than the infinite past story. But I'll just, go into confessional mode and tell you sort of what I think. A conception of the world that provides an answer to this question, why is there something interesting rather than nothing, is better, more plausible than one that doesn't. The answers divide into these two kinds, contingent and necessary. All the contingent stories that I've heard have seemed unsatisfactory. I'm setting to one side necessary stories about contingent things, which deserve, as I say, scrutiny. But let's set them aside for now. I think the best necessary stories about necessary beings do not suggest that the interesting necessary being is made out of matter, for the reasons I gave. They posit a necessary being that's distinct from the universe that caused everything else. Now, does this constitute a kind of knockdown argument for the existence of God? No. It involves eliminating a lot of candidate necessarily existing causes. So even if God is the best hypothesis, it might not be a more likely hypothesis than the disjunction of all the alternatives. So the odds on the favorite to win a marathon might still only be 1 in 20 or 1 in 100 if there's lots of runners. That might the one runner might be much more likely than each of the others taken individually, and yet still have a small chance of winning. So in this case, there's candidate necessary causes, generators of interesting contingent stuff that aren't like the God of Western theism. Or there's also pluralities of necessary beings. That's a possibility we haven't even considered. Okay. A second reason it's not a killer knockdown argument, being able to answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing, only gives a theory a prima facie boost. So I'm not assuming the principle sufficient reason, but there must be an answer to the question. So in other words, it's other things being equal, a theory that explains more is better than its alternatives. But of course, other things may not be equal. For instance, the problem of evil, okay, raises severe difficulties for the supposition that the greatest possible being caused our universe. Is it worthless then? Well, no. I think if a conception of the world is better with an answer than without, then having an answer is a good thing. It makes that conception of things more likely to be true. The cosmological argument in something that's recognizably similar to its original form can serve as part of a cumulative case for the existence of God, as it does, for example, in Richard Swinburne's work on the existence of God. The existence of interesting things raises the probability of there being a very interesting thing, a God who causes everything else. And this is not to deny that it also raises the probability of other candidate necessarily existing interesting things, but by my lights, the greatest possible being should get the lion's share of the likelihood provided by this particular piece of evidence. So let's end again with this nice picture of Blake's God. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much, Dean. I'm just going to set up for Q&A. I want to make sure that the people in our audience Last questions. I also want to start the camera, so I think I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to focus the camera on you. Is that okay?
And
Well, I'll linger it back. Hopefully people online are seeing that at least it's not displaying on our screen, but it should be displaying online.
I see myself.
There we go. Good.
You might need to do the room camera one.
Oh yes,
Oh, yeah.
Invite. I think you have to invite people to your.
from the laptop.
Yeah, to your web.
Fine.
Invite to cameras.
Okay. I have no idea how to do that.
In my camera, I'm turning this.
Yeah.
So why don't we do that? Let's see. My camera,
Oh, yeah.
there I am. You can focus it as anyone who asked the question.
Okay, good. Can I borrow your pen for a moment? Sorry. Thank you. Okay, so I'll take a question. Okay, 2 days. Yeah. Elmar. Okay, and yeah, I've got you two. Yeah, okay. I'll start with Patrick then. Just yeah, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. I was sort of interested about these physicists like Prof and Hawking who, know and accept their kind of four-dimensional general relativity way of thinking about the world, that there's just a four-dimensional mass energy distribution. But nonetheless caring a lot about this question of what happens at the start of it, like where did it begin from? And the idea that it began somewhere and then evolved from there is not very general relativistic. It's not really just saying there's a four-dimensional mass energy distribution. I suppose my question is like, do you think this question of why is there something rather than nothing boils down to that how did it begin question? Like what happened? How did the universe start at first time t equals 0? Like how did the Big Bang happen? Because I would certainly think that, these physicists, I'm kind of surprised to hear that they kind of boiled down to that question, because I feel like from the kind of perspective of people who very much subscribe to kind of four-dimensional Einsteinian spacetime, the question would be more, there just is a four-dimensional mass energy distribution, and then the question is why? So like, would you say that in your mind, why is there something rather than nothing is a question that kind of focuses on the first time and why something started, and then the rest of it just follows from there, but really it's a question about time 0? Or do you think the question is more a question of why all times at once?
I take it to be a question about, all the interesting things, whether they go back without end, literally ad infinitum, or whether there's a finite past. And I think, these the cosmologists these days, I'm, far from knowing very much about cosmology, but sort of hang around cosmologists and read their popular writings. They sometimes consider cosmological theories, descriptions of space-time that have finite pasts, and they sometimes posit space-times that are literally infinite. It just happens that Krauss and Hawking thought that a certain kind of finite to the past space-time its existence could be explained by a law of nature, that somehow it was probable. Others have proposed I mean, infinite inflation is a real, going hypothesis, which has some kind of field that has always been generating universes. I mean, there's every bit of it. There's always a chance that it's going to, So if that's the case, then we've always had interesting things. In either case, I think you can ask the question, why any of this stuff? And one perfectly legitimate thing to say is, well, there's no answer to that. But some people try, and so I take it to be a question that really isn't just about times zero, as you say.
Well, good. Okay. Next question.
First of all, thank you for talking for a very interesting point. I had a question. I have a lot of questions. I'm gonna try to boil it down to 1/2. And I suppose it concerns the all else being equal part of the story. Because there is one thing specifically that bothers me, which does not seem to be equal, which is causal closure. As in the idea that something non-physical can cause physical things. Well, causal closure is the opposite idea. That if something causes something physical, then that thing is physical. And this theory would contradict that.
Right.
And I don't know, this does not seem like a very economical thing to grant, given the implications that it would have. Mainly the fact that something non-physical might be causing physical things right now. It doesn't really need to be God. It can be something lesser than God that is operating right now without our knowledge. And I guess this also relates to how you conceived possible worlds at the very beginning. If I understood correctly, you thought of them as something we posit, not really as something that is out there.
I think of them as out there the way numbers are out there.
Okay, yeah, they're not really something we could not go to a possible world.
Right.
Yeah, it's something we posit starting from this one, or at least that we conceptualize starting from this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Because if we do that, I would say that the only thing that stays consistent between every single world that we can conceptualize is the things that world is made out of. I can conceive of a possible world, I don't know, that is only composed of elephants. I can do that. The only thing that will stay consistent between that one and this one is the basic stuff that characterizes it. So I don't know, it seems like both of those things lead more heavily towards the universe as a physical thing is the necessary cause that we're looking for. And I don't know, I wanted to just throw it at you.
Okay.
That's what you thought.
So is the first thought that if we suppose something that isn't made out of this kind of stuff could cause this kind of stuff to exist,
Yes.
then we've kind of opened the door for ghosts and souls and angels and
well,
other kinds of
possibly.
misbehaving.
Possibly. You
things.
don't have to be that. I mean, angels are a bit of a commitment as well as ghosts and all such. Just there might be something immaterial causing something material right now, right here.
Yeah.
And that's a commitment. And I don't know if it's a commitment you're comfortable with.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Oh.
But
Okay.
I'm pretty easygoing, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think of the causal closure of the physical as like a good methodology in doing sciences where you're studying physical things. But not as like an inviolable principle. I mean, I think the puzzling thing about supposing that something non-physical causes something physical is, well, what kind of laws are that relate these things, you know. Uh, um, but you know, whenever you have a thing of a very different sort that has effects of some other sort, that's pretty wild, you know, and that happens all the time. You know, you've got a particle with mass. It has these, the gravitational effects are different from the particle, you know, and it moves things, or well, more electromagnetic field that sticks out from a thing is very different from the thing itself, and the effects it has are different from. It can have effects on things that are very different from it.
Yeah.
So, you know, the other thing about the nature of these other possible worlds, I think I agreed too quickly about how they're sort of projections of our ways of thinking, or how they are kind of constructed from the concepts that apply to stuff in our world. I would think that it's possible for there to be worlds where the laws of nature are very different, the stuff is very different, and so and simple thinking things, you know, maybe are possible. So stuff like that seems possible to me, and in which case I'm going to say, well, maybe there's a possible world where that is true. You know, perhaps there's a deep incoherence in a non-complex thing that thinks, you know, like a simple substance that thinks, but I don't see it. So I'll allow that there's a possible world like that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dean. My first, I've got a comment and a question. I suppose my comment really follows on from what Patrick was asking there about the physical explanations, and just to give some steel, I suppose, to the sort of explanations that Lawrence Krauss and Stephen Hawking were giving. It's not so; these aren't simply a matter of exotic speculative physics. Something coming out of nothing are very clear, real physical phenomena. Take Casimir forces in a vacuum, which are between two metal plates, and there are particles there which come in and out of existence, and because of those, and because of the distance between the plates, there's a force experienced on those plates. Similarly, in Feynman's sum over histories approaching quantum mechanics, we have all possible histories that are there, giving a real physical effect. So it's not simply a matter of something coming from nothing being a speculative idea about starting the universe. That's just to give a little bit of steel to those. Now, I would grant, of course, that these are still contingent stories, that we still have a world in which maybe these laws obtain. But it is, if we get it right, an enormously parsimonious contingent story. And maybe that's all she wrote. So that's just a comment on that.
Can I say something about that?
Oh, yeah.
So I kind of like the idea that if the thing from which which counts in some sense as nothing, even though it is, if it's parsimonious enough, or if its description is simple enough, it could be special enough that you might say is necessary. You know,
well, I would say that.
I know you're not saying
that's
that,
the best
but
part.
if it's special enough, you know, I could see someone going in that direction. And I think Quentin Smith thought that, you know, if there were a particle at the beginning of the Big Bang and it was super special, it could be a necessary thing.
Yes.
And everything would.
And
I know you're not going there.
No, I wouldn't. I concede it might be enormously beautiful. That
Yeah.
you simply have these sort of very small set of equations. We could say from that, you know, we got universes or multiverses and all the rest of it. But I think in tough people like this, they say, you know, a set of equations does not have the ontological heft to produce the universe or multiverse or any of that. Well, you were bringing the necessity there, which really comes to my second question. When we want necessity, and maybe the essence on which necessity is based, the crystalline clarity and certainty of mathematics is usually wheeled in. Unfortunately, I feel when we look at mathematics, it's not the crystalline certain world that we think of. If we think, you'd use the example of the sets of numbers 1 to 10. If, of course, we have sets, we immediately run into the Russell's paradox, and we have to do an enormous lot of work to get out of that.
Yeah.
The second thing is the numbers themselves. There's set theoretic constructions of them. We have Zermelo, we have Russell, we have Newman, all the different advantages and disadvantages. But Manasaraf wrote a great article, What Numbers Cannot Be. And he says, if it's any one of these things, despite they have isomorphic structures, it can't be the other ones. So it can't therefore be any of them. He made a very clear case in this. But the problem with this crystalline clarity in mathematics is it simply doesn't work. If you take something like the axiom of choice, the very simple notion that if you have a bunch of sets, you can take exactly one element out of each set and form a new set. We need that to give something very simple in mathematics, named the comparability of sets. For any two sets, they have a number of elements in them, and we can compare them to either the equal in cardinality, one is greater than the other. You can't establish that without the axiom of choice. With the axiom of choice, however, we get paradoxes like Banach-Tarski. You can take a sphere apart and make two spheres of the same number. We get things like Vitali sets, which have simultaneously got a measure of 0 and non-zero. Now, the best defense I've heard of this is that, well, we need the axiom of choice because on the balance of absurdities, we get more things we want out of it than things we don't want out of it. So when you look at mathematics, we don't know what numbers are. We're not sure about creating sets of numbers. And mathematical foundationalism at the moment really seems to me to, not be fully established. It hasn't really beyond Principia Mathematica and the shadow of Gödel over that. And Principia itself is, it's ramshackle. He brought in axioms of existence, which are non-logical, and things like the axiom of reduction. To say babies, he was thrown out. Sorry, with a bad one. Sorry, Dan. So if you're going to get necessity from somewhere and then apply it to something like great as being, I think mathematics is not the place to look. And without it, I'm not sure where you're going to get a clear notion of necessity. So,
yeah. So, I was appealing to the sort of philosopher on the street view that, well, mathematics gives us some necessary things, only really to set them aside as, okay, I don't want, maybe those things exist necessarily. What I want to know is whether interesting things exist necessarily. And I hope that I can make sense of a kind of necessity that doesn't depend upon mathematics being well established. I take your point that there's controversies about the foundations of mathematics, in which case there's controversies about which mathematical statements are necessary. Now, if we could treat all of mathematics as kind of a fiction, or be intuitionists about it or something, I wouldn't have thought that that's going to threaten the metaphysician who wants to say there are truths that are true in every possible world. You could appeal to logic anyway, but then I'm afraid you're going to come back at me with always logic. There's higher order logic is so useful. A lot of people are saying, just go with it. Don't worry about it. Is higher order logic logic? I'm not sure about that, but there certainly are some truths that seem like logical truths, that they couldn't be false. And I'm hoping that we can make sense of necessity, possibility in terms of that.
Yeah, I don't mean downstairs as well.
Thanks. I'm going to switch sides quickly. So
I'll be the buzzkill and bring in continental philosophy into this, and I won't be talking about neat analytic things anymore.
This wasn't very neat or tidy, I have to say.
Well, it's about to get a lot less neat. So I have more or less 3 points. I'll go down them in order. I'll start with Heidegger. So I think it's kind of interesting that you didn't mention Heidegger at all. I mean, that is his big question. Why are there beings when there could have been nothing? He dedicated his life to that and to being awful, but you can only have one master. I guess what I'm trying to say is Heidegger, towards the end of his life, started saying stuff like God is nothing, and being is nothing, and the nature of nothingness. And I guess I would say, if you're looking for what do you call it, a self-existent thing or a non-derivatively necessary thing, I think the thing that all things derive from would have to be not a thing. And that's what Heidegger means when he says the word nothing. And so we're left with this unknowable, inaccessible nothingness, is kind of Heidegger's point, and that it's fundamental to the existence of the universe. It doesn't make sense to talk about God as a being, because then you've gone right back to metaphysics. If you want to answer this question and do real ontology, is what Heidegger's trying to say, you have to go to this nothingness, to this null set, because it's the only self-existent thing. If there is,
There's not really the null set, though, is it? Or is it?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's kind of hard. I would probably imagine it's less than the null set. Because the null set implies the possibility of there being beings within the set, but the nothingness is below that. So the nothingness is there not even being a null set. It all gets very complicated and all that after this point, and he doesn't really make arguments in the kind of premise, conclusion style afterwards, because what he's basically saying is you have to feel God at that point. That's the only way you'll ever have any kind of relationship. I guess my second point would be, even if we go and say, well, actually, there is a being. Well, so my first question is, what do you say about that? My second, because I've been told I have to frame these as questions. And my second question would be, well, okay, let's say that actually there isn't this nothingness. It doesn't make sense, and we know for certain that it's not there. There is only beings, and there are non-material beings and material beings and interesting beings and non-interesting beings, but it's only beings. Let's give you that. My question would be, but we can't say anything about that being. So you could say, even if you know for certain that God created the universe, you couldn't say that God continues to exist. So you have mainlanders kind of theology metaphysics, and he describes the notion that the universe started from the death of God, that God existed and then killed himself to bring about the entire universe. So you could say, yes, at the very first instant, and only in that instant, there was a God. But you can't say anything afterwards.
You can't. Why can't you?
Because a plausible notion as to how God created the universe would be his self-destruction. And my third argument would be a kind of Kierkegaardian point, that God resists any kind of rational explanation, because a being like God is capable of doing the impossible. So to say there are a set of reasons that could ever constrain God, that God would have to follow, or that God could create reason, it misunderstands the nature of God. God can both create a boulder that is more heavy than himself, and also then lift up that boulder. And the absurdity is the essential part of God, because anything else could be described as necessary or contingent or being within the world. The absurdity is the essential part. And yeah, yes, those are my 3 points. What do you think?
There's obviously a whole lot there, and a lot of it depends upon deep knowledge of figures that I don't know. Okay, but that doesn't set them apart from lots and lots of other figures that I don't know very well. I mean, I have friends who really like Heidegger, and and get a great deal out of Heidegger and have encouraged me to read Heidegger. And I've made a feeble efforts in that direction. I find him really, really, really hard. I have to say. I have to say. But you know, when you get to the things he wants to say, it seems, do come close to things that I bump into in medieval thinkers and apophatic approaches to God, and claims that, you know, if God is being itself and everything that has being is being because it's related to God, it might not, you know, it's easy to see how it might feel wrong to say that God has being. No,
Yeah.
God is being. Now, why you would go on from that to say God is nothing?
No, it's not a thing.
Not a thing.
If you
Okay.
think of thing as being,
Okay.
the big point in Heidegger, it's pretty much the only thing he says, is that beings, like bodily beings or energy or whatever, are different from being.
Yeah.
Sometimes he even spells being with a Y, just to really hammer in the point.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that is, and I think taking a radically different approach to God may help to explain why God's nature would explain God's existence. I mean, if God is God's nature, and the nature is itself being, but God isn't distinct from God's nature, I guess.
If his nature explains his existence, then Heidegger would probably say you're already thinking God. God
Yeah.
can't exist. That's the whole point.
Okay.
Because he's existence itself. And if he exists, you're thinking, and it doesn't matter how great of a thing you make him, you think him.
Yeah.
I have to insist on
sorry.
moving. It's okay.
But I mean, this is fascinating, and it is definitely continuous with, you know, philosophical figures that I'm interested in and do study, and I get to Heidegger and I find it so harsh. But that's you know, it's deficiency on my
Fran.
Yeah, Francis Stewart, the novelist, used to remark that things would have been much simpler if nothing had ever existed. Of course, you raise all of these interesting questions. And in fact, I'm interested in your use of the word interesting. You distinguish between interesting things and boring things. Surely the question of why does something exist rather than nothing applies to boring things. What do you mean by, and that's just a preliminary to clarify, what do you mean by, what's the difference? I mean, the interesting things, do you mean, is that interesting things which causes stuff? I mean, do you mean active in the sense of Plato's in the sophist?
No, I just mean I was thinking some people are going to say, and maybe not you, but some people are going to say, there's Frege's world of abstract things, and of course to some people that's very interesting, but they're abstract. They don't interact with the physical world. They're just, and they exist necessarily. And I wanted to just set them aside and say, okay, you know, maybe there is such a realm, but we want to know why there's stuff that can move around and have effects and or be an effect.
But why not simply, I mean, use the simple distinction between, you know, things that really exist and things that really, which exist notionally or which exist intentionally.
But so if we're willing to say that Frege's realm, the third realm of abstract things, is just they just exist notionally, fine. Then what I'm asking about is the other things.
Things which really exist.
Yes.
Okay.
Can we have an explanation
Right.
for why any such things exist?
So that would cover potential being, including, you know, inert matter. I mean,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, inert things that happen not to do anything.
Yeah. Interesting. Today is the 750th anniversary of Aquinas' death.
Oh, is it?
And the 7th of March, yeah. And he remarked, and in fact it was the line that I was most interested in, which I had read it out. Here is the platitude, but the necessity of contingent things. He remarks somewhere, just as an aside, there is nothing so contingent but it doesn't bear within itself at least some necessity.
Mm.
So, I mean, and I think that would come across from the very facticity and the bruteness of existence. I mean, Coleridge has a wonderful passage in Friend where he says the fact that there is now something, whether it's a need for a pen, necessarily means that there was never a time when there was nothing. The fact there is now something means that there always was. Julie Andrews in the Sonnet Music says nothing comes from nothing. So I mean, the necessity surely derives from existence. And you were talking that. Okay, just hop to another question. I mean, you referred to necessarily existing things.
This must be the last question.
Yeah. I mean, conceivably, is it possible that there would be two necessarily existing things?
Yes. And this kind of Manichaean dualism, if both were necessarily existing, would be an example of you've got two necessarily existing things, one's good, one bad, and that doesn't obviously violate the principle I was proposing about don't posit that something's necessary if it's really similar to all these other things. Now, if they're really special, there might be many, each individually special, there might be many necessary things. At least that's a hypothesis worth considering.
Elmar.
Thank you. I have a question that's related to the very first question. I just wanted to hear more about what you had to say about natural law in relation to what Stephen Hawking in particular had to say. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more. And so the question is sort of like, why does it matter that it's not plausible as a natural law that the universe would have to come into existence in virtue of some statements being true, maybe?
Yeah.
And let's back that out in maybe two ways. I know some people have continued this argument and said something like, well, it might be a sort of meta law. It's something that's true in virtue of the fact that there are natural laws. So it's a law about laws, maybe. It's at least a truth. And so that's one thing. And another thing which came up in your talk and also in the Q&A was this issue about whether the natural laws are necessary or contingent. So you did assume, in at least in the presentation, that they are contingent. But I would think that somebody who's trying to present like an argument against you, like saying the scientific ways are a little bit more plausible than you're making them out to be, they would at least allow for the possibility that, well, it's actually the case that natural laws, some of them, the ones that are interesting, they are necessary. And this meta law then is maybe derivatively necessary in virtue of those laws. Does that make sense to you as a?
Yeah, let me try to say something there. I think David Albert and Tim Maudlin represent two very different ways of thinking about laws of nature. So David thinks, and my colleague Barry Lower too, they think of what laws tell you are what are acceptable patterns in the mosaic of space-time, and which ones would violate the laws, which ones are inconsistent with the laws. So the laws aren't basically about telling you the powers of things and describing how things push and pull one another. They're just like prohibiting certain arrangements in a four-dimensional space-time. Maudlin, on the other hand, thinks what laws tell you what things do. Laws tell you if you've got an arrangement of things and they've been in such and such a state, they're gonna evolve into further states, and that's sort of the form that laws take. So laws, but on either story of what laws are, laws don't themselves generate anything. They put restrictions on either the shape of the mosaic, or they tell you if you've got some stuff, here's what it can do. in so and so circumstances. I tend to like that second view about laws. I think
The maudlin one.
the maudlin one,
Yeah.
yeah. But in either case, if laws are like either of those pictures of laws, then they um, they presuppose stuff in order to be applied to anything. And what Hawking and Krauss seem to be supposing is that there could be a law which says, which is sort of effective on its own, which is able to explain the existence of something, and not by being true of a physical arrangement, which then must be accompanied by some other stuff. So it's a very funny kind of law. It's like some principles that Derek Parfit posited to explain why there's something rather than nothing, which are things like axiarchism, which is the thesis that it would be good if there were a world and that goodness is effective. And so the fact that it would be good that there's a world explains why there's a good world. And there, the thing that does the explaining is something like a principle that says good things tend to be. Not that good people tend to bring about good effects, rather just good things tend to, exist. If laws are abstract principles, they don't seem like the kind of thing that should be bringing stuff about. Now, the other thing that you were asking about was something about
Necessity of law.
Oh, their necessity. So that is something you could propose, is that the fundamental laws are necessary. And there's a funny way in which I'm kind of attracted to that too. Sidney Shoemaker had this idea that what laws of nature are really about, they are like summaries of how the powers of particulars interact, how the powers of particles and the powers of fields interact. And if you have particles of that sort and fields of that sort, and these powers and liabilities are essential to the things that have them, then these laws about them are necessary. But that doesn't rule out the possibility of particles with slightly different masses and fields with slightly different kinds of forces. So you still get you could still have a lot of contingency on that picture. And I don't see how the necessity of laws of that sort would explain why there's any particles.
Yes,
Last question, Keith.
Right, so that was great. I was wondering about kind of explanation which I think you didn't really consider, which is just the universe itself as a necessary existence, and in particular, why should we give the existence of God as a necessary being a higher credence than the universe itself being necessary? Just to motivate that a little bit, I mean, it seemed like the question of why is there something rather than nothing was interpreted in the way of, well, how could something come out of nothing, or how did the universe get created? And maybe we think about the Big Bang as being the sort of start of the existence of the universe, but there are cosmological theories where the universe is kind of oscillating, it keeps banging and collapsing, or maybe it bangs and then something else comes out from there. So the answer could just be the universe had to exist, it's necessarily existing. It couldn't have been the case that there was nothing.
The sum total of everything being the necessary being, that I take it as a good candidate. And I was trying to raise some objections to it on the grounds that of its seeming contingency. I mean, certainly we cook up alternative theories about what it's like. You know, there's some theories according to which it is infinitely old, and there's the Steinhardt picture where it's collapsing and expanding, and it's done that infinitely many times. And then there's pictures of it with it where it's fine. Well, those feel like they're alternatives. They seem genuinely consistent anyway. So possible universes. Are those descriptions of the same entity? I mean, that would be the way to allow for contingency of the shape of the universe, broadly speaking, shape, while saying it's a necessary being. You could say, well, it would have existed with an infinite past, but as a matter of fact, it has a finite past, but it's the same thing.
I suppose I'm thinking that that might just be a function of our ignorance. We don't have a complete completed physics, and then it may be, as Elmer was suggesting, the laws of physics might be necessary. Once we understand the necessity of the laws,
Yeah.
it becomes obvious the universe had to exist. It's always existed. It will continue to exist infinitely. So,
I mean,
but why would God be? Why should we give
Yeah.
higher credence to God
Yeah.
as an explanation than that sort of necessary universe?
so the competition here is between a universe that's always existed and it obeys necessary laws.
Yeah.
And it had to exist. And I think the fact that alternative descriptions of the physical world are so easy to come by, and they, you know, it seems to me anyway that a universe that's existed infinitely would be a different thing from a universe that's the Hartle-Hawking sort of thing that has a finite past. Then if both of those are possible as alternatives to one another, then neither one is necessary. And so that's where they go down for me in terms of plausible alternatives. Yeah.
Finish there. So I just want to thank you very much.
Thanks for all these great questions.